If you want to learn about the chaos and practical insanity that is generated by succession claims, and how can it be possible to generate order and a very well-oiled, functioning organization out of such absurd quagmires, then stay tuned. Welcome to Biblioccultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Doing these things really helps the channel out and it allows it to grow, and I would really appreciate it. Follow me on X, and I'll put the address below. You can also interact with me if you're interested or if you want to suggest a book. Now in this episode, I'm going to go over The Mormon Hierarchy, Origins of Power by D. Michael Quinn. This particular edition was published by Signature Books in 1994. Now this is part of a series in which the author goes deep into his research on Mormon history and the structures of authority, etc. So it's a very cool series. This one in particular goes into the evolution of the structure and hierarchy of the organization. Now, as many of you may know, the Mormon organization, the LDS as we know it today, and specifically I'm talking about the group in Utah, which is the most famous and the one that most people think about, is an incredibly well-oiled machine. Just even looking from the outside, it's fairly obvious that it is a greatly well-organized religion with a very well-structured financial infrastructure, and it has been functioning in that fashion for a couple of generations. And this book goes into detail about how it evolved into what it is today. Now, the author goes into the historical backdrop, and just that part in itself is fascinating. It gives you a perspective on the origin of the Book of Mormon, and in particular, the organization itself. And I did like the fact that he pointed out that organized religion in itself was fairly uncommon in the early North American experience. That at the time that Joseph Smith came about, it was primarily a folk religion that was fairly common. And Joseph himself actively participated in things like using divining rods and magical wands and casting spells and the search for treasure and these kinds of things. And all of that was fairly common in all folk religions. And if you study folk religions in Latin America and in Europe, etc., they're all fairly common when it comes to how they develop and what kind of practices they have. And in New England, at the time of Joseph Smith, it was fairly common. Usually rural or decentralized colonies are going to have, by their very nature, a more folk manifestation of religion. And this was the case at the time of Joseph Smith, which engendered a lot of creativity when it comes to their Protestantism, which is itself very creative and a divergence from what you will call Orthodox and Catholic Christianity. And the New England of the time of Joseph Smith, there was a lot of new religious movements that came out, and there are a lot of great history books just on that period of time that I suggest people read if you're interested in that topic. Now, one thing that the author points out, and I can't go through details of the book, I'm just giving you a taste of it, but the original revelation that was given to Joseph Smith and his claims of apparitions and the first vision, etc., they all seem to characteristically share a mood, which was decentralized, a very open-minded, kind of loose conception of a church, meaning church was any group of Christians who gathered in the name of Jesus, kind of taken from the New Testament, and even lacking concepts of baptism and initiation, but more of a general idea of what Christianity should be. And that's reflected in the different versions of the first vision, because you have a first vision in which Joseph is simply asking, what is the right religion and, what should I do? And the answer is just pray to God, and whoever does right and follows me is part of my church. And that eventually evolves into something else. But the apparition of angels and the bestowing of priestly authorities and these kinds of things came later. So it first starts with Elijah, who became the first personage who gave legitimacy to giving keys of authority to Joseph and a lot of his family members and friends. And it continued going through Adam, who he considers to be Michael the Archangel, which is fascinating as well, because that used to be a common viewpoint at the time and in the area as well. And that's why you see a lot of similar groups that came out saying the same thing. Although eventually this whole Adam thing becomes the Adam God doctrine, which is, again, a very fascinating development in that particular religion. Until eventually Joseph develops things like the patriarchal lineage of priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood, the order of Melchizedek for priesthood. So you can start seeing a development of a hierarchy, of a lineage of different orders of priesthood, which obviously is the beginning of a ecclesiastical structure, a organized religion. You can see the same thing develop in the case of political authority. As people that have read the Bible know, the Bible starts out as a classic theocratic system of judges, and then it develops into a monarchy. But those who have read the Bible remember that the monarchy was seen as a necessary evil of some sort. And in some cases, it could be interpreted as a punishment, because the preferred system, according to just a straight reading of the Bible, was a theocracy. But it developed into a monarchy that still has a theocratic structure, but it did change into a monarchy. And if you remember, the Bible treats this development as a negative, as a historical necessity, but as a negative in comparison to a pure theocracy. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because in the Book of Mormon, there seems to be a reverse conception of this idea, meaning the monarchical system is assumed as the primary system or the preferred system. And there seems to be a negative viewpoint on a theocracy. So I did a review on the Book of Mormon. If you want to watch it, you will be able to find it easily on my playlist. But there I go over the interesting aspects of the Book of Mormon itself. But here I'm only going to point out that Joseph Smith develops a conception of theocracy and monarchy that is very interesting, and his movement started to not only develop complex infrastructures of organization, but it also developed the concept of theocracy, a slow rejection of secularism, and a viewpoint that eventually led to declaring himself a prophet and king, and actually, interestingly, assuming the position of not only a general of a militia, but a political authority that also became hierarchical with the Council of 50, etc., so that it went from being a very laissez-faire, relaxed conception of religion to a very hierarchical ecclesiastical structure, and also a very complex secular, to use a term, structure that included him as a prophet, seer, revelator, and as a king. Now, this issue of this parallel political authority is a key issue in the succession crisis, because these different councils that Joseph Smith created, like the Council of 50, which is a more political council, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, which is a more ecclesiastical structure, but that really was meant to organize preaching and structure the spread of Mormonism, created a confusion because not only you had these secular structures or political structures that even included non-Mormons in the Council of 50, for example, with religious or theological structures like a priesthood, and those had their own organizations and sometimes multiple organizations that managed different things. And Joseph Smith would switch between them or modify them or alter them constantly through revelations or just a whim. And then you also had two infrastructures. You had a public revelation dynamic and a private secret doctrine element as well in there that influenced both the public and the private, so that you could have constantly people say, well, in private, Joseph Smith said X, or he did X thing, but in public, it was a Y action. And they would justify it, very similar to the concept of taqiyya in the Islamic worldview, in which you can justify obscuring or hiding beliefs because of the impact that would have socially on the outside world, or on the world of the Gentiles, as the Mormons would call them. So this obscurantism also created a lot of issues, because you could have secret, direct revelations that would argue for doing things that should not be said publicly, etc. And as you can imagine, in a succession crisis, that's going to be quite a mess, as you will see. Now, of course, all these dynamics and complex systems and somewhat contradictory doctrines that would manifest in secret or in private and then in public eventually would become known to their neighbors. And obviously, as you can imagine, this created a lot of tension and conflicts, which created then the circle of having to hide doctrines or obscure them, etc. And all of this creates distrust in their neighbors, which, as you can imagine, would already have some kind of fear of new religious movements and what they meant, especially if you have a mass of people that move into a town that share the same religion, but you don't know really what they believe in, and you don't understand what they mean or want or what they plan to do. So all these things are going to create a lot of conflict, and definitely, as those that know the history can see, that it created a lot of death and destruction, where Mormons would go into a place, they would either get harassed or killed or pushed away, and they would have to constantly emigrate and fight, etc. So that the whole history of the hierarchy, of the structure, and the theological dynamics of the religion are deeply influenced by the circumstantial aspects of their development. And then the very natural development of the Danites, a paramilitary group that deeply influenced also the structure and the inner dynamics of the theology of Mormonism, because they naturally would be compelled to defend themselves. So they went from a pacifist group in a way. I don't think they were ever really fully pacifist. If you read the Book of Mormon, it's not a pacifist book, but the mood was non-violent. But with the Danites, they developed into a paramilitary group that would not only be defensive, but in many times would be offensive and aggressive to defend their rights or take vengeance and spill the blood of the enemies of the saints. So that it's clearly a natural development of hostility and conflict with your neighbors, but it's a fascinating development. Not all religions do that, although you could argue that every single religion in the world, Buddhist, Christian, you name it, can start out to being somewhat pacifistic, and then they develop into a more militant group as they acquire more adherents, etc. But the point of the hierarchy is that the Danites also had a secret society structure, and they had an internal organization, which is very similar to the Masons, which Joseph Smith was also a master Mason, and a lot of the structures of the inner authorities within the Mormon system, they're also based on the Masonic infrastructure. So again, that's another layer of authority and hierarchy that is added into the mix. Now, on top of all of this, Joseph Smith also decided to run for president because he felt that the federal government was not doing enough to protect the rights of Mormons, and he also had a political viewpoint on this, so that his presidential run was also important because now not only do you have the kingship theocratic structure in Nauvoo, Illinois, where they had gathered and been able to take positions of secular authority, judges and mayors, sheriffs, etc. And you have a theological system with different lineages of priesthood and patriarchs, etc. But now you also have a political campaign and all the dynamics that are involved in that. And as you can imagine, that adds another layer of authority and hierarchy. So once Joseph Smith gets martyred, killed, then the succession crisis comes about. And all religions suffer from this issue, every single one. And it's actually one of my favorite aspects to study in religion, because I've always found it fascinating how human beings deal with this issue. The Islamic succession crisis is fascinating, and we still see the results to this day. The Buddhist succession crisis is very fascinating as well, not well studied by most people in the West, but in the East you will find a lot of great books on just that topic. And you can go on and on. Most religious movements have this issue. And today, the umbrella of Mormonism has a lot of groups as well. And they go from really small groups that may have just dozens of people to hundreds of people to thousands of people and to millions of people in the case of the biggest branch. Now, the one that is the most famous are called in the book the Twelvers, which I found it very interesting because that's another name for a particular sect within Shia Islam. Obviously, they're not 12 for the same reasons. The 12 is a reference to the quorum of the 12 apostles, which are basically the ones that assume in that particular branch the authority of succession. And they are the group known as the Latter-day Saints, with their headquarters in Salt Lake City, Utah. But you do have these other very interesting groups, and I would even argue that just from reading the book, I came to the conclusion that that was probably a correct decision on succession. But again, very difficult because they all have their good points. And obviously the Twelvers are the ones that won the argument in the sense of massive amounts of support and growth. But you do have other groups, and I would say the Strangites are the most fascinating because Strang not only claimed to be a revelator and a prophet, but he would even argue that he also discovered another hidden book from the ancient past that he translated. And therefore, not only was he assuming the mantle of Joseph Smith, but he was even assuming the prophetic authority of Joseph Smith by even finding a book and translating it. So just that is so fascinating to me. And he ended up in a very strange position, claiming himself a king and also being a notorious polygamist. In the case of Joseph Smith, polygamy was another issue in the succession crisis because one of the secret doctrines of Joseph Smith was polygamy, which he practiced in his religious movement, although publicly was usually denied. So you have a public presentation again of polygamy and a private. So once succession comes about, polygamy is one of the issues that divides the groups into different sects. The Twelvers in Utah were also polygamists because of Brigham Young. And I would say Brigham Young is such an important personality in the Twelver Utah group because of his deep influence. And also I would argue Brigham Young is, in fact, the master organizer, because for him to be able to survive the succession crisis, he had to invent a new way of organizing using the basic infrastructures that Joseph Smith left, but he had to create it from scratch, because if you just based it on Joseph Smith, you would have no real organization. because it was all over the place, chaotic, and he also had a tendency of naming different people as his successors, so that you would have so many different people that can make a claim, because Joseph Smith made different claims for different people. For example, his sons, he had Joseph III and he had David, who was still unborn. He made claims for both of them. And eventually, Joseph Smith III became leader of the reorganized Latter-day Saints Church, strongly anti-polygamy at a time when the Twelver group was pro-polygamy, so that was a contrast there. And then you have a lot of statements from Joseph Smith that he believed that his son David was going to be almost like a God king who was going to save his people and await the Messiah to return. But then David, sadly enough, ended up spending most of his life and dying in a mental institution. So that's a tragic ending. And this whole part of the succession crisis, to me, is the most interesting of the book by far, and all the different dynamics that go into that. So I would say a big portion of the book in the center are notes. And it's very important to have them because you have to justify and explain and source a lot of the claims in the book. So I would say to those that might be skeptical on the book, you have to read it and then go through those sources. It's very difficult to argue against the well-done research that was put into this work. I want to close the review by reading one of the last paragraphs in his conclusion, because I think it's such a wonderfully descriptive presentation of Joseph Smith, his impact on history and also on his organization. I can't help but think that this is actually pretty cool. In a strange way, the way this is presented, some people could think it's a negative or it's a slight against Joseph Smith, but I actually don't think so. I think it lays on the table a very fascinating human being that has had a very important impact on history, and those that are followers of his may agree with me that this makes him actually an interesting person. Quote, "Few Mormons today can grasp the polarizing charisma of their founding prophet. Some may feel uncomfortable when confronted with the full scope of Joseph Smith's activities as youthful mystic, treasure seeker, visionary, a loving husband who deceived his wife regarding about 40 of his polygamous marriages, a man for whom friendship and loyalty meant everything, but who provoked disaffection by testing the loyalty of his devoted associates, an anti-Mason who became a master Mason, church president who physically assaulted both Mormons and non-Mormons for insulting him, a devoted father who loved to care for his own children and those of others, temperance leader and social drinker, Bible revisionist and esoteric philosopher, city planner, pacifist and commander-in-chief, student of Hebrew and Egyptology, bank president, jail escapee, healer, land speculator, mayor, judge and fugitive from justice, guarantor of religious freedom, but limiter of freedom of speech and press, preacher and street wrestler, polygamist and advocate of women's rights, husband of other men's wives, a declared bankrupt who was the trustee and trust of church finances, political horse trader, U.S. presidential candidate, abolitionist, theocratic king, insider to riots, and unwilling martyr. So that gives you a very beautifully concise description of a fascinating man. And you can take him as he is and decide whether or not you think being that kind of personality is a positive or a negative. That's up to you. So, great book, highly suggested, not only to learn about the backdrop and the history of a very successful and very well managed organization that keeps spreading throughout the world to this day, but also as a general lesson on how organizations can change and morph and adapt and improve even in very difficult situations. So hopefully you enjoyed the review. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video, follow me on X, and I would really appreciate you doing all these things. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.